executive and a member of the Board of Trustees, and delighted to be speaking to you today with some friends and colleagues. We follow the last session, which focused on aesthetic rights, and touched much on actually the topic that we're about to discuss with you today. I have a fantastic panel for you here, compiled of people with backgrounds in media, intelligence services, and entrepreneurism in AI and blockchain. So we have an expert panel that has a lot to contribute to the thinking on this topic, which is the topic of cognitive empires. Let me briefly give an introduction to that, to set the scene so we're all very clear what we mean by a cognitive empire. And the important part of this is that the world thinks technology is, of course, about productivity, jobs, and the diffusion of AI. And on the dark side, people think AI is about control. All of that is true. But to discuss that would be actually a waste of this podcast, because that is not probably the most important thing that is happening with technology and AI today that we need to focus on. We're in a revolutionary moment, like the Industrial Revolution, but we're going to argue far more profound. We're going to say this is a civilizational moment. The world is split into those that have the science and technology and those that don't. Those that have it will run the world and conquer the others. And let me explain what is really happening to us and why we think this topic is so important. At the threshold of the Industrial Revolution, approximately 200, 250 years ago, those with the technology figured out that they could set up factories at scales never imagined, employ people, work them hard, pay them little, and get away with that too, plow this money into ships and goods and go trading around the world, arrive on the shores of foreign lands with superior goods and superior arms to add security over time, and at some point calling their king or queen to help them to ultimately conquer the people with the inferior technology. You see why I say that it really matters who has the technology and who doesn't? Being sold the technology is not the same thing. Today, this mechanism that resulted in colonization is much more efficient and vastly deeper. You can sit in Silicon Valley or Shenzhen and send out through the internet a platform, a social media platform powered by AI. And people start to use it as a tool of self-expression, to connect to others, to collaborate, and to react to what they see. And a number of things happen in that process. The first is that it's a neurological impact. So as you consume this, your learning system in your brain starts to react to it and starts to learn how to react very quickly. It's almost spontaneous, and it weakens the part of your brain that is meant to be reflective, producing networks that get reweighted between reaction versus reflection, and you become faster and faster at just reaction. At the structural level in the brain, what happens is that the density of the brain and its synapses seems to change. And over time, this weights towards reaction more and more, and less towards the regulation of the brain. There is also a case to be made that this has a behavioral impact that is so profound that it changes the marker on the genes, the epigenetic. And so it's intergenerational in terms of its impact. What the technology does is it governs your attention, ultimately influencing your behavior. So whereas once upon a time, the merchants arrived by sea, today they're just arriving platforms. But the labor is free. No ships or armies are necessarily needed. Their government's job is just to make sure that the regulation in the countries they arrive at doesn't get in the way to allow this technology to be placed in the hands of everybody. And everybody has it all the time on their laptops and in their palm tops, and they're using it constantly. The labor is free. There's nothing to pay because the labor is actually attention. And this attention is monetized at great scale through massive ad revenues that make the sellers of these platforms worth hundreds of billions, if not trillions. So it captures his attention, it changes the neural response, it modifies our real world behavior. So it's colonization in some ways without the armies. The deeper reality is that technology today is about power, wealth, individual human agency, and sovereignty. So we're now approaching an information age, split between those that have it and those that don't. When the technologists arrive in any country that doesn't have it, and they say they're going to set up a data center, we celebrate, because it seems like it's a mark of saying that we have the engineers who could actually man those data centers, who could work in the programming, who could alter these platforms, who could deploy agents. But actually, those are the same agents that are designed to actually conquer the brain. So this isn't a tech cycle. It's a tech cycle actually masked to be a civilizational threshold where we're being conquered. The flow of this is the power, the sovereignty, the capability stack, the systemic reinforcement of behaviors, the strategic ownership of the data and of the minds and the behaviors by people who are not indigenous to any country. In fact, if you own one of these platforms, your first job is to conquer your own people. There is no counterweight to this phenomena. And today, what we're going to discuss is, what is this phenomena? What makes it so powerful? How does it operate? And can we actually escape it? So that's the purpose of this conversation. As I said earlier, we have a fantastic group of friends and colleagues to discuss this with. I'm going to take each one and briefly introduce them. So we have Glenn Gaffney. Glenn is somebody who spent 31 years in the intelligence services in the US, heading science and technology. Having got to know him, I would say, yes, of course, he understands intelligence, power, how it gets deployed across the world. But at core, he's a scientist and a technologist. He's a nerd. He loves technology. From an intelligence perspective, if you watch films, he'd be Q in the James Bond films. He's that kind of man. John Miller. John is somebody I've known for nearly 25 years or so. John is an expert in the field of social media and the technologies that underpin that. He has a deep understanding of how media reaches out to people and captures them. He's been the CEO of AOL, of News Corp's digital business, and a number of other digital businesses in all sorts of media platforms. Chairman and CEO of these businesses. He's also an investor in large technology companies and social media platforms and companies, as well as entrepreneurial ones. We have Annika Rao-Manori, who is an entrepreneur. She's a physicist by education and training, worked at CERN applying AI for a period of her time, spent a small amount of time in banking, and then became an entrepreneur in blockchain and crypto. Made some breakthroughs that put her in history as one of the early pioneers in the field, and is somebody who's built an AI business that's extraordinary in terms of its scope and its potential disruptive power. So it's an interesting group to discuss this subject. I'm going to go to each one and ask them to give some opening remarks of between 5 and 10 minutes. And I'm going to kick off with John. John, over to you. And I know that you have something important to say that sets our scene.
So thank you, Ketan. Thank you, fellow panelists, and good day, everyone. As Ketan mentioned, I have a background that includes being involved very much in the dawn of social media and throughout this period, which I think is particularly relevant to our overall discussion, as social media forms the substrate for, I think, everything that we're seeing now in terms of influence and ultimately the impact of AI. and the evolution towards cognitive empires. Um, and what I'd like to do, and Catan laid out a lot of the kind of large arc of it. I do want to break it down a little bit because I think one of the things that we're not particularly cognitive about is that how sophisticated things already are in this regard, how much they influence us day to day, and how methodical it already is. And this is before we get to the evolution of the more sophisticated technology that's coming online now. So AI and its influence isn't taking place in isolation. It's really taking place on top of what has already been a pretty significant rise in the ability to influence humans through technological means. And so I'm going to go through just a bit of the couple of things that happened and has happened to all of us in the social media era, and how it sets the stage. And I think we all know, coming from kind of the era of media that was television and radio and print and so on, that had various forms of influence and much more so over time. In the United States, a watershed is considered the 1960 television debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. That if you just looked, many people say, I should say it that way, that if you just looked at the text, you would have thought that Richard Nixon had the better debate. And because it was a visual medium, it was considered one of the moments that perhaps put JFK over the top and he became U.S. president. So that was kind of, in many ways, a hallmark of the television era, as the sort of pinnacle of technological influence. But since then, with social media, we've really seen just a very significant change. And first of all, just to break down some of those that again set the stage. It used to be somebody programmed this to you. Now it's an algorithm, it's a platform. And just that alone switches the whole paradigm, because the algorithm and the platforms are trained to look for all kinds of things, from watch time, your past clicks, interactions, what other people are doing, and continually to test, refine, and reinforce certain things. And this very quickly has evolved from being a connection between humans on something like Facebook to filter bubbles and echo chambers where you only see information that the algorithm believes is relevant to you based on your behavior. So your behavior reinforces all of that already. So it's not just that, what the algorithm believes or wants to believe, though that is a piece of it. It's how all these things interact. And so just that level of kind of real-time interactivity has never been seen before and is now baked into our lives and our system. Underneath it, there are many, many interesting things. There are social rewards like likes and follower counts that trigger different kinds of literally dopamine responses and reward responses in our brain that reinforce, our behaviors. There's intermittent and unpredictable reward systems, such as, things that are pushed into your social feed that you didn't expect, but, surprise you in a positive and engaging way to you. And as Ketan mentioned, this all has a real impact on the developing brain, particularly if you look at adolescent studies, all of us, even as adults, but very much so and very clearly with adolescent development. And as social media has become the predominant form of interaction for social media, I mean, for young people and news consumption and so on, it is both shaping and being shaped by our collective behaviors. And then you think about how intrusive it is. Digital notifications and things like that can interrupt and grab hold of our life at any moment. We all know certain tones or things or notifications and things like that we all react to. And this kind of thing, we're just being more and more trained to be responsive to the system, to the algorithm that's producing it. And we are being trained by it to be responsive to it, almost on a constant basis, throughout our day. And then there's really, and Ketan mentioned this, and it's important, one of the concepts is information overload. In these digital environments, push people fantastic amounts of information from which they make very, very quick, shallow, usually fast processing decisions as to what to potentially consume another moment of. Not even necessarily a longer, much longer time, but literally moment by moment, which, as mentioned, this directly encourages reaction rather than reflection. And so we are training ourselves to be that way, to be reactive rather than reflective. And you even see this, jumping ahead for a moment, to studies, current studies of AI usage, where people's cognitive skills atrophy quite quickly when they use AI instead of going through certain mental processes they could sometimes refer to as mental friction, cognitive friction, to develop their own thinking. So it's very quick in how this happens. And then we have another aspect, which is in these echo chambers and these bubbles that, frankly, we all end up living in. There's common knowledge within, but is not necessarily shared without. So there's a set of norms and a set of understandings and a set of beliefs that take place and harden inside these echo chambers that are not necessarily A, connected to the full truth, B, susceptible to further influence once they harden and are reinforced inside these social circles. So this kind of sense of common knowledge, um, we've never really seen before because there's always been ways to challenge it. And now it's becoming a self-reflective system that is very closely controlled, and it's very hard to get influence inside of that once it's formed, other than things that reinforce the already held common knowledge. Again, common knowledge being a term of art in this case. And I think, just one or two last considerations on how all this sets up the age of AI now is, think about how we continually construct and edit our own identities through our profiles, our posts, our images, stories, etc., and how fast we get feedback on all of that. So these means are directly shaping our own sense of self and our own sense of self-esteem, and in some cases anxiety and so on, and particularly again in adolescence. Um, we've never had a system that basically real-time edits and evolves your own personal identity, and that's what's happening now. And so all of this leads to how we have been conditioned as a population through several large platforms that are very sophisticated in a series of these kinds of things to not only modify our behavior, but modify our cognition. And it does so both consciously, that we are aware of certain things that we do, and unconsciously in just what we respond to, and how the system, once it learns what we respond to, continually refines and feeds us more of that. And that leads to things like we've all seen, more outrage and more emotive kinds of things. Once we all react to, on a statistical basis, we all react to more greatly than other types of things. All of this exists, and all of this has been continually refined over the last 20 or so years with the rise of social networks and their proliferation to be these huge global platforms with billions of users. And now we're adding AI to it. And I'll stop there because we'll talk more about the effects of AI as we go throughout this panel. But what I just wanted to say in these opening remarks is this is already the ground that's been prepared for the next wave of technology to go on top of. So it is a clear through line, kind of influence, as Ketan said, outlined in an historical context, all the way through to today. But really, this is just setting up what will now happen, and the power of AI attached to all of what we just described. So I think we are entering a new era. It is both continuous in that it builds on all of the things that I've just been describing, and discontinuous in its power to influence all of us. And I think we need to not only be mindful of that, but mindful of what are the potential antidotes to it, as we'll talk more about today. So thank you, Ketan, for giving me a few minutes to establish that, and I'll turn it back to you.
John, we needed that because we needed to go from the macro, historically contextual architecture to how is it actually interacting with us and what is the role of social media? Glenn, I know that you're going to pick up now and talk about the nature of AI in this story. Let me hand to you.
I am. I'm going, thank you. And I will get to AI. I really want to focus on the intersection of governing and technology and some of this change that John has been talking about. For years now, when we talk about IT and we talk about IT stacks and the development of these stacks, you even mentioned it in the very opening, Ketan. We talked about data centers and establishing data centers. For years now, countries have been talking about sovereignty in terms of sovereign data, and sovereign data as a way to protect their nations and a way to protect their public. And I've been an advocate for this and working on solutions to actually bring data together, use data more powerfully, and protect sovereignty. So I've been an advocate and a supporter of this, but I really believe that this is at best a secondary issue to the issue that we're talking about today in terms of cognitive sovereignty. The real battle is cognitive sovereignty and establishing where sovereignty truly lies, because there's no basis for a social contract between the governed and the government without it. And so, to answer the question about where sovereignty lies, we need to consider the question who owns the infrastructure through which our attention, our actions, our decision making, and the execution on those decisions actually flows. And I believe that this is where sovereignty lies because it's where we have allowed the levers of story, as John was just talking about. We allow the levers of story and influence to shape our lives and what we perceive as experience. Our brains reward the completion of a story, and they're highly efficient at it. And what's interesting is it's been proven that your brain rewards itself for completing the story, regardless of whether the story is true or not.
Yeah.
And so that triggers this dopamine effect that John was talking about, and one of the many that are involved here. And so this perception of experience just grows in this space, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. But we as a people on the planet are going through a massive shift. We're shifting from a data economy to what I think of as the knowledge economy. It's not so much about as the shift goes on, it won't be so much about the amount of data that someone or an organization holds and puts to work, but more about in the knowledge economy, the speed at which we leverage knowledge and utilize autonomy to act faster than our competition. Because the speed in applying knowledge to action is what's going to define winners in business and in warfare and in any one of a number of different competitive arenas. We're going through a massive shift where we are globally connected, yet increasingly isolated. And what's fascinating to me is that we're not paying attention. And we're not paying attention in part because we've let our attention become monetized and increasingly monopolized. And oddly enough, we freely chose that path. We're going through a massive shift where we are dehumanizing people based on differing ideology, right? Which is exacerbated by those echo chambers that John was talking about. And while we're dehumanizing people based on differing ideology, we are trying to humanize machines. We're going through a massive shift, and we're not being purposeful at all about how we're navigating through this change. And if we don't start in terms of being purposeful about this and don't work it together, because it's not a nation by nation thing, we have to do this together, we're going to be in real trouble. Now, I'm not as a tech and as a nerd, as Ketan introduced me. I'm not sitting here. I'm not going to bash tech And I'm not going to talk about slowing down tech advancements. Don't fall for simplistic arguments like that. I'm a tech and I'm a proponent of it. But we do have to be serious and sober about what we have produced and what we are producing if we're going to protect what is perhaps the most fundamental of human rights, which is cognitive sovereignty. And so some of the conditions that we have to actually think about here, tech is not just a tool anymore. It's the infrastructure of our lives, and it's the infrastructure of our experiences. Tech is, as we've said for many, many years, it's not inherently good or evil, but it can be used and used at massive scales now for both. And it can be used at massive speed now, and speed will increasingly become the measure. And it will be done at speed and increasingly without human control or intervention. Because if speed is the order, then humans will slow down the process. And if speed is going to determine the winner, then we're going to actually automate more and more in that decision space and the way that we actually approach these competitions. The problem really is a problem. It's not tech that's the problem. It's the way that we develop the information ecosystem and the markets around that tech, as John was talking about, and the ways that we've let consumerism become an insatiable appetite and let efficiency become a global idol. We're living with the set of conditions that challenge our understanding of sovereignty. And it's challenging it like it hasn't been challenged since the time of Hobbes and the Peace of Westphalia in the 1400s. Nation states today don't understand the tech, and global hyperscalers act like nation states. And what's happening right now in this current age is that at best we are seeing states and corporations coming together into some really interesting but strange hybrid power structures. The power and levers for this infrastructure are concentrated, Ketan, as you said up front, in a very few. The policy levers that we've created through former industrial regulations don't actually apply in the macro sense. And it leaves governments today to pulling familiar policy levers that at best treat the symptoms and not the root cause of what we're dealing with here. Powers being exercised through states that shape attention, belief, and behavior at scale, and a governed choice while preserving the appearance of autonomy. There's 5 or 6 critical technologies that are really going to shape civilizations as we go forward. And we already talked about AI, quantum compute and quantum inspired technologies, another key area, gene editing, virtual reality and extended reality are going to play an increasingly important role in influence and in our cognitive development or decline. And then fusion that powers all of these things, and nanotech, particularly in the intersection of nanotech and bio. Private sector competition over the tech stack that supports these things is actually critical to our future because it's the foundation layer of how we perceive, develop context, and in the end, act and interact. Recommenders, agentic AI, all tuned to you, as John was just saying, all tuned to your person, your personal needs, your personal interests. Eventually, we're going to have more than one recommender. We'll have recommenders that are tuned to us for specific things that we're doing to increase efficiency and reach. And all of this will happen because it's all carrying our digital twins. And it will all be done for faster and better actioning or decision making. It's all tuned to influence according to our preferences and at the same time, as John was saying, shaping our preferences. And so I think one of the key questions is who owns your digital twin? As the recommenders are developed and fed to us, somebody else owns that digital twin. And what is their business plan for monetizing the value of that asset? How do they actually think about and service your need and influence you towards their end in this space? Information, story, and image have always been the lever for influence operations. What's changed is the personalized tuning to gain a massive effect at global scale. What's changed are some of the business models and that are made, and the person, and to the point where we actually influencers have become a personalized business in and of itself. And AI is not the reason for the issue, but like so many things for the future economy, it's going to serve as probably the most powerful catalyst in industry since electricity. And when we talk about then this problem, AI is not the reason for the problem, but it is going to be like pouring very expensive fuel on a dumpster fire if we don't actually begin to address it. And I think I'll stop my opening comments there to let Annika talk about the way we actually should be thinking about measuring this.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you. Yeah. Just a step back again. So we laid out the historic and macro architecture. We went deep into the interface of social media and how it operates as an influence substrate. We spoke about then governance, technology, multiple technologies actually, of which AI is one, which then promulgates this capture of attention and the challenges to our sovereignty and our individual human agency. Let me turn to Annika. Annika, you're a practitioner. You've actually taken these big themes, you've examined them, but you've also built technologies that can make an impact on sovereignty and human agency and the efficiency of the current systems too. How do you reflect on this topic of cognitive empires?
I thank you very much, and thanks to my fellow panel members for going in deep on kind of I like to think of it as wave one and wave two, according to your original paper about cognitive colonization. There is a quote that I wrote down from your paper I would like to start with, where you say defining cognitive colonization, where cognitive and affective functions, including judgment, are progressively captured voluntarily and without conscious awareness by algorithms optimized for engagement rather than human flourishing. And I want to break that down into two waves. John talked about the first wave, which is social media, which was designed to capture attention, right? You know, you're looking through a feed, echo chambers, you become more reactive. You become more emotional, more polarized. There's an internal divide of society. But, you know, at the end of that first wave, people still, in some sense, retained a level of questioning what it is that they were looking at, understanding that things were coming from a feed and they were being pushed at them. And so there was a level of judgment that people managed to retain. The difficult thing is the part that Glenn was talking about, which I like to think of as wave two, which is the kind of AI or ChatGPT or what have you wave. And I look at it as this is the true capture of judgment. And according to your paper, that poison pill, the last line of defense we have as human beings to cognitive colonization is our individual ability to retain judgment. And so I would say the biggest risk and the thing that governments need to be thinking about, any kind of humanitarian organizations, corporates, and we as individuals, as societies, need to think about is not, of course, the regulation of the platforms is important, the regulations of the technologies and what have you, but the real in my opinion, important thing to focus on is the retention of individual judgment. And unfortunately today, AI, and as Glenn was saying, how fast this technology is advancing, there is a choice. And because of the commercialization, because of the way the technology is being rolled out, and by the way, as Ketan said, I am a technologist. I'm not here to bash the innovation. What I'm saying is there's basically two choices, right? One is substitution and one is enhancement. And if you look at as Glenn was saying, whatever it is, digital twins, if you look at these different technologies and all these things coming out, it's designed for substitution. So social media captured attention, created polarization, and a very kind of a debilitation of our ability to make judgment. But AI captures our ability to judge, period, right? And the fluent answers, there's tons of research on this, the fluent answers that come out of ChatGPT or what have you, they're winning debates even with no data. People are believing them because it sounds like it makes sense. And people are stopping questioning the integrity and the truth, and analytically questioning the information that they're receiving. And so to tie it all the way back into your point, and I think one of the most significant findings in this paper is really that the last line of defense we have is that judgment. And if we don't focus on regulation and protection at the individual cognition level, then that's where the problem is. And certainly in terms of measuring, that's the main thing that we need to measure.
Thank you. We've explored again the scope, and I have to step back and say a few things, which is each of us here, of course, doesn't assume that it's other people who are being colonized and not us. Everybody on this panel, including myself, believe that all of us are being influenced subtly, silently, and are effectively advocates of the colonization by passing on information that we capture online to other people that represent our views. So here's the subtlety and the smartness, the almost Machiavellian smartness of this all. We go online with our views, we capture information, we find it attractive and interesting, and we pass it on to our friends. We encourage them to believe the things that we believe. And together, we become different from when we began, slightly less judgmental, slightly less able to pass this information, slightly more reactive and more polarized in the process. It's something that happens to all of us. It doesn't matter whether the technology, we're Americans and the technology came from America, or we're Chinese and it came from China. All of us are subject to the same influences, subtle, silent, scalable, and pervasive. We live in the habitat that is technology enabled. And in some ways, our neurology and our psychology fuses with the technology to create one environment. And this is the power of it. To pick this up, I'm going to set a little bit more context and then ask us to come back to some of the major themes that we've just laid the stall out for. So the first is people collectively respond faster than institutions do. And as Annika said, I think very interestingly, it's in two phases. In the first phase, we still thought we had lots of agency, and we did actually, to some extent. The Arab Spring of 2010, 2011 spread across borders at a speed that no previous revolutionary wave had achieved. Then in Sudan, you get 2018, 2019, a coordinated, sustained uprising through encrypted messaging and social media, outmaneuvering the security apparatus, which was built for an earlier, more industrial information environment. In Iran in 2022, you saw the Mazamini protest spread and sustain itself through digital networks, despite the state trying to stop it. In Bangladesh in 2024, you had student-led protests coordinated through social media, contributed to the fall of the government that had held power for 15 years. If we intersperse two more things in there, three maybe, you had the Brexit referendum of 2016, shaped by micro-targeted digital campaigns at a precision level that you hadn't seen in a scale that you hadn't seen previously in a democracy. You had the French Yellow Vest movement, 2018, 2019, organized, sustained, radicalized in some way through social media. And then in 2021, you had the assault on the US Capitol, assembled, coordinated, incited perhaps through digital platforms. But what this showed us was that the digital platform gives the cognitive architecture that can mobilize physical activity and action, including violence, at scale, not just in countries that you might have thought were failing nations, but in leading democracies. And that spread doesn't have to be ideological. The spread is the spread of the architecture that produces the movement as an output. So it's automated in a way that we haven't experienced before. When I step back, I want to begin with Annika, with you. How would you measure something so complex where so many people are interacting all at once, and so many people are trying to figure out what they believe by going online to search? For people participating in this forum and watching it through the WAAS platform, I just want to say that all four of us and some others are part of an institute set up in London designed to examine sovereignty, of which cognitive sovereignty is one element. Glenn, John, Annika, and myself are part of that, as are others. Annika.
Thanks. I think it's a very I think in terms of measurement, there's probably three levels, just as you explain in your original paper: the micro, the meso, and the macro. Ultimately, in terms of measuring the kind of sovereignty of a population in terms of their cognitive capabilities. But ultimately, it boils down to judgment and how that judgment is affected or replaced, and whether it is consciously or subconsciously being replaced. I think there are a ton of different vectors and variables and ways you can measure this, but the approach that I've taken that I think is probably the most practical and actionable that I could come up with in the time I was doing the research is thinking of a model that's something like this. If we assume that cognitive capture or cognitive colonization is a real phenomenon, what would be the practical consequences? What would people be using it for? How does that actually result in the kind of collapse of like an empire or a population's ability to and previous philosophers and things have talked about, the move to totalitarianism. It's when there is no longer a value of the truth, for example, right? So how do we practically measure where we are? The way I looked at it is, if you have an actor, let's say it's a presidential candidate, and you have an outcome that they want to achieve, which is they want to win an election, for example, then if there is a level of cognitive capture of the population that is then, like ultimately the medium through which they achieve their outcome, the actor achieves their outcome, how do we measure how effective or in what way they could leverage the cognitive colonization of the population in order to achieve their outcome? And so that's kind of the basis for how I thought to start measuring this. And I divided it into three kind of parts that kind of like that cognitive colonization part. So there is the content and the medium. So that might be something like AI chatbots, that could be deep fakes, that could be social media posts, that could be what have you, right? Content. The second one is the environment. So that's through whether it's a social media platform or a specific type, whether it's through digital surveillance mechanisms, whether it's a combination of the two, whether it's AI platforms or digital twins, what have you. So there's the content and the environment, and then finally there's the substrate, and that is the kind of demographic attributes of the population itself, the different groups of people, because as we all know, we can see with research, without like no judgment exerted, I'm just creating population groups. So there's depending on income, depending on age, depending on gender, depending on different religious beliefs, what have you. Some are susceptible to certain types of content more than others. Some use certain platforms more than others. So if we're able to kind of measure within a country and within a population the kind of different distribution of groups that exist based on the population, based on the platforms that are available, and based on the pervasive content that's there, we can measure and predict a path through that medium, those three layers, for the actor achieving their outcome, and then start to put in place protections and actually start to analyze how would one go about strengthening the defenses to an actor trying to achieve that outcome by focusing on for example, whether it's an elderly group who uses WhatsApp and spreads information by sharing it that way, and they believe that, then maybe actually they can put regulations in place for what kind of information can be shared. Or maybe there's like a restriction that regulation can be put into, the mass messaging. There should be a choice rather than it just arriving to you or something, right? So yeah, just to summarize, in terms of measuring it, there are lots of ways of measuring it. I think the most important thing is to focus on something practical. And it's essentially, if this is all true, how would people use it? And can we predict the best way of them using it and then protect against that? And so far, some of my research has, I've done sample cases on previous occurrences of this, and there definitely is a model there. So it will be nice in about a month from now when we publish it to be able to explain that and hopefully help regulators use it for their own protections.
Thank you very much, Annika. This has been a huge task because Annika has sourced maybe 2.5 million data points, established a model with 33 different variables in the equation. The numerator looks at capture, the denominator looks at protection. The protections are weak, so weak they're almost non-existent. Then mapped it on countries, although the individual is not necessarily associated with the country when they're on these platforms. But still, we stuck to countries in one cut, and it starts to reveal how red, if you like, how colonized is the world versus how green, uncolonized. And I would say that as we publish this report, what you'll see is this report from the Institute will show that just about the whole world, if you're connected, you're colonized. You're either at the tipping point or over it. Most of the largest countries are well over it. The only countries that are not colonized are ones that are not really connected. They haven't got to that stage of the digital trajectory of their country. Glenn, Annika spoke about an agent who wanted to achieve something. How important is intent in this? And is the barrier for entry for colonizing and polarizing high or low in terms of how you see it?
So I'll start with the last and work my way back to the first. I think the barrier is extremely low, because the barrier to entry is really just access through your phone, through the platform, through any other thing that is there to be able to begin to move ideas or push these ideas forward. And the sharing of ideas is not the problem. It's the way that those ideas are then captured, repackaged, reformatted, and sent, and the ability to create content with the intent to influence, right, is in everyone's hands, right, today. And very easy to build off of and achieve, and will be exacerbated as we actually merge the worlds of virtual reality and extended reality. One of the things that on my darker days that I think that I worry about is the idea of creating entire populations that are completely virtual, but then bridging a polling factor from a virtual population that someone has created and controlled into, right, real world information space with the intent to influence based on those kinds of numbers. And you begin to throw not just influence, but weighted influence, which can all be created in minutes, right, relative to a platform. And so I think the barrier's low. And I think, and so I want to shift now to intent and the importance of intent. I want to talk about intent in two ways very quickly. One is it won't take much for a government or anyone who might be in power to choose to pull the levers to influence in a specific direction and begin to colonize or take control. It's not to say that they are, it's not to say that some are, it's just to say that it won't take much in order for that to happen. The bigger, and that's a problem to be sure, right? Because it can happen at scales and scope that we haven't dealt with before. But the scary part of this is that it happens, the cognitive effect happens whether someone is intentionally trying to manipulate your your cognitive ability or not, right? And so it's already happening, and which is why we have to take action. Another point on intent, and I want to use this to tie into what Annika said right up front when she was talking about substitution versus agency or representation. And I think that the tools that she is developing, the modeling that she's developing, will provide an opportunity for us to think about how we represent things going forward and begin to restore agency or put agency back in place. When we're training analysts, particularly in the intelligence business, one of the things that we talk to them about is intent and intent to influence. And so when you're receiving information and you're receiving information from lots of different and disparate sources, we teach analysts to actually think about this information that you're now receiving, however you're receiving it, maybe have was given to you with a specific intent to influence your thinking in a particular direction. And it's such an important concept that we actually print it on some of the products that we put out so that every time they look at it, it says right up front, this has an intent, right? May be given with an intent to influence. And that motivation for influence may be high or it may be low. But it's a not just an instruction in the beginning, right, of helping folks weigh information and think through information, but it's a repeated thing as they're actually working in the system and through the system, actually trying to ascertain, right, and discern what is real and what's the intent to influence and where is the intersection of those two. We teach folks on the analytic side to think in terms of probabilities, likelihoods. And we think of that both in terms of the input, the data that's coming in, but we also have them think of it in terms of the output, right? Relative to confidence measures, highly confident, moderately confident, right? We put categorizations around some of these pieces as we're putting information out there. This is a way of thinking that's designed to help folks challenge, right? and do the kinds of challenging to information and data that Annika was just talking about. And I believe the tool set and the model, the things that she's actually modeling and beginning to pull forward can actually help us think more purposefully about how we teach folks to deal with potential intent to influence, probabilistic input, probabilistic output, right, in the way that we think through these things. To make one last point on agency, I'll go back to that who owns your digital twin aspect of this and say that I think there's opportunity that should be thought about, should be debated, should be discussed about what does remuneration look like for individuals if it's your twin that's actually being used? What say do you have over how your twin's being used going forward? And what does that look like in terms of value to you, not just in terms of the way they're feeding you, but the way in which your digital persona is being utilized.
Glenn, thank you. Glenn, there was no inclination, of course, to say that when people were being colonized in the industrial era, they should have not adopted industrial technologies themselves. Of course, they should have. The fact you were at a disadvantage meant you were at a structural disadvantage, not just a technological one. So you had to adopt it. The question is how you protect. And that is not well understood in today's environment, of course. John.
And to add,
Yes.
I'm sorry, to add to
Sure.
that, just to briefly, is that we know that these technologies as they're coming forward, if we're not purposeful about how we enable, right, then we will make the digital divide greater. It will rapidly expand that digital divide, right, between the haves and the have-nots. And without actually purposefully building it and bringing them into that, helping folks actually achieve in that next age, we should be building the things that they need in for cognitive sovereignty in at the ground floor, right?
Yeah, this is a Thucydides trap for us where having it, is a problem. Not having it is also a problem. We're in our midst is the rising power and the rival power at the same time. John, have we met the real enemy yet?
Yeah, this is a question that literally keeps me up at night because there's so much going on all the fronts we've just described in this panel, and of course in many other areas at the same time as well. And so if you're trying to form counter strategies, where do you start? And you want to make sure, at least in my view, that you're fighting the real enemy, so to speak. And I'm not sure I'm going to give the clearest answer. I'm working on it, as I think we all should. But one or two quick stories. So I recently shared a stage for another panel with a very well-known person from one of the large platforms. I'll protect his identity for here. And he was asked a question around the data protections that his company had in place and how one should feel about the amount of data they now had, the amount of data on individuals they were gathering going forward, and the protections around this. And his response, which struck me, really, to my core, was and effectively the question was, are you, who are you to have all this information on all of us? And his response was, what government would you rather have this information? Think about that for a second. This was a company head, the CEO of a platform company, being asked a question about data protection, and his response was, would you rather me or your government, in effect, have this information? And it just completely struck me as one of the fundamental questions around this. What is the real enemy? And how do we think about platforms that are multinational, global in scale, that have access to much more information than perhaps any single government, and in some cases more economics than almost any government on the planet. Or potentially you're elected representatives, or you're not elected representatives, non-elected representatives. And so I think that is a very deep question as to how that gets sorted out. Then the obvious, I think the obvious other area is ourselves. You know, how should we feel about ourselves and our own cognitive vulnerabilities as individuals and populations? And as Annika referenced, you know, our ability to maintain judgment through all of this. Are we the issue, and what do we have to do to train ourselves and potentially retain that ability to have judgment and understanding, and as Glenn said, of the probabilistic nature of all of these things, and how to not let that, you know, affect us as if it was something greater than that. And so in that regard, there's a saying in the industry around all the kind of free services that internet providers offer, from search to ChatGPT and other things like that, and Facebook for that matter, and other platforms like that. So the saying is, if you're not paying for it, i.e., you're not paying for it by putting cash on the table to somebody, if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. So, meaning the reason it's free to you is because they are extracting value from your engagement that is much greater than just what you're putting in, and that they can afford to do all of this for literally billions of people around the planet because you are the product. So I think you have to think about that as well, that this is how we are being viewed as individuals and collectively by these platforms that are supplying these services at scale across the planet. So, whereas I don't have the answer to this question, and I think it's one we all need to reflect on and decide how we want to interact with that answer, meaning if we have something we believe should be done or we want to do ourselves, I think, you know, it's partially in that context. But I think these are a couple of the things that frame that question a little more deeply, right? The role of multinationals versus sovereign governments and different types of governments, how we are directly being targeted, exploited, and used as products, if you will, for these platforms and for these technologies and abilities to influence ourselves in the loop that we've described here. So I'll leave it with that, and I wish I could tell you the exact answer, but I think that's a way to think about this kind of deep question.
That's a scary one. I'm going to throw it straight back at Glenn for a short. I'm going to ask each of us to interact on this. Glenn, if we're the product and we are losing our agency, and what is left then?
Yeah, well, it goes back to where we started in terms of monetizing the attention, right? And you know, the great science fiction movie, The Matrix, showed human beings as batteries, right? And the reality is that if you're not using the power, you are the power, right? And this whole concept of I can afford to actually give you something that makes your life easier for free and underwrite the cost, because I'm extracting value and energy from you. And the competitions that we see in terms of future autonomous platforms, the competitions between big companies that are driving data and influence in the automotive industry. There's a real battle for the infrastructure there. Is it a car that is autonomous, or is it a computer that actually moves you from place to place? And that battle is a real pitched battle that's going on in the industry right now. But in the end, they will underwrite and save costs associated with it by drawing information from you and what you do while you're on the ride, right? And whether it's entertainment or something in those spaces. So I think it's back to where we started in terms of how it gets monetized. I think going forward in terms of the real enemy, I don't think this is in absolutes. I think there will be enemies that appear, right? I think, and there will be clear enemies, right, that look to influence and look to absolutely monopolize. I think where I tend to focus is we have to actually take ownership of some of our own responsibility here, because we've made choices that have allowed some of these things to happen. But how we equip and how we actually help people take back agency, right, is really an important piece, but people have to actually want to take it back. And it starts with actually pointing out, as you know, you did with the original paper, on cognitive sovereignty and colonization, because this is the issue. So taking some of our own responsibility, but then looking at how we use some of this technology and put not just controls, but enable the kinds of things that should go with this next age, that then puts agency and puts agency back, right? Responsibility back, where it belongs, right? And that, I think, yes, we have met the enemy. It's us. And we need to actually engage, right, thoughtfully to turn these things into a better future.
Glenn, I'm going to take that to say we've always thought we were fighting the enemy outside, and it's easier to do so because you arm up and you conquer and you kill and you think you did something useful. Of course you didn't, because the enemy was inside. All that fear, anger, and hatred was inside that you were expressing outside. And the absence of the conquest inside led you to fight outside. But to bring it to a very implementable part of that story as to how one augments that agency. Annika, you've looked at technologies that can augment that agency, protect the individual in their interface with the AI, create that sovereign data layer. And that's what your technology is doing. Can you spend a few minutes talking about that so we understand it?
And if you don't mind, there is some, I just wanted to bring a ray of light into this conversation a bit, because it's been a little bit depressing in terms of where we've ended up. But you know what I'd like to say is the following, and it does tie into my my company and what we're doing. You know, historically, and it does support the argument, like, who's our greatest enemy? In some sense, it's ourselves. And I'd like to, you know, without getting too cliche, but you know, the brain versus the heart, or the mind versus the heart, in the sense of, you know, these AIs, these models, right? They are built to understand model text patterns. They are built on the framework of language, the rule set that defines language, and they make all the fundamental assumption that you can proxy understanding with you know, a kind of you know, semantic understanding of concepts and ideas with the, you know, modeling of language, and the representation of language. And they're designed to take 1.6 trillion parameters that model different parts of language. And if they get enough data, then you can, the kind of assumption is, if I have all the language, all the words and all the text in English, and I have a mechanism that's modeled every single possible rule or relationship between that text, then effectively I can create a proxy model of understanding, because every single possible combination of what the output language could be, the response to that input, you know, I have all that information, and I can model it, and it will appear like I understand it. Whereas fundamentally, I think, you know, one of the main ways we retain agency, kind of ironically, because over the last you know, couple of decades, we have moved as a society to devaluing the arts, devaluing more kind of emotional based kind of like cognition, and things that have more to do with intuition, more to do with, I know it's kind of become a myth, but what people can perceive as the right brain kind of activity. We've sort of discounted that. We've defunded arts programs, we've defunded music, and instead focused on science and all of these things. But if you think about it, a machine, an AI, there is no heart in there, right? Just like what they would classify as a human psychopath. You can understand what an emotion is, you can't feel it, right? These AIs, they don't have. There's no mechanism that's been designed or built into the system for it to have any kind of grounding or triangulation of what truth or what something means. It's just text. Right? It's just literally understanding a secondhand depiction of something. And so in terms of preserving agency, I think a very strong part of that is kind of reversing a little bit some of the kind of sort of focus that we've kind of created around STEM and around analytical thinking and all of these things, and starting to revalue the more kind of abstract thinking, the more kind of emotional or arts-based activities as a society, because that kind of neural activity presents at least a sort of second opinion or evaluation or a judgment of information in a slightly different way, consciously or unconsciously. And to tie it back to my technology and what I'm doing, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get closer to modeling information more similar to the way the brain processes concepts, and it links concepts together in information. So, once you sense it, whether it's with your hands, whether it's with your mouth, whether it's with your ears, there's information that comes inside. It kind of ultimately, a few layers up, gets grouped together into like a conceptual structure of information that's been distilled down and retrieves memories and information from all of those sensory inputs. And so the way that we're trying to model information is to welcome those additional sensory inputs rather than build a system that's purely based on distilling literally just the analytical patterns in language. So yeah, I mean, it models information in a way where we are trying to improve human, invite more judgment, let's say.
To make that link from that statement to something macro that is a question from the audience, from Gary this time. I'm going to direct it at John. John's also an executive member of the Board of Trustees of the World Academy. John, we've had a long-standing theme now of examining the rising levels of turbulence in the World Academy. And we've looked at the poly-crisis, the intersection of many crises that create our current environment, as well as the meta-crisis, which means that you can't act on it effectively institutionally. Do you think there is a relationship between this turbulence and the cognitive global capture that is happening? Is there, and what sort of relationship is there, if you think there is?
I do, and I think there are a number of relationships. One is that one of the consequences of what we've all been talking about on this panel is that populations are more unsettled and unhappy to begin with, more reactive, as we've talked about, more emotional, and so on. So it's become a much more polarized situation, and therefore, and in the reactivity, much more able to be manipulated. So we're seeing that play out in any number of ways. And with information bubbles, you also see that in any number of ways. There's people that believe in climate change, and there's people that absolutely do not. And the thing that gets lost in that is the scientific basis for the discussion. And so I think that underneath all of this is when you have less of a shared reality and less of an ability to have people agree on how to have a shared reality. So it's both. You don't have it and you don't have an agreement on how to have it. Then how do you tackle these other problems? And these other issues that come to the fore can be manipulated against specific populations that allow them to continue to develop and grow. So I do think, what part of my perspective is underneath many of the things that we consider to be the polycrisis or whatever, is the lack of a shared reality and the inability to figure out as a collective world population how to get from here to there to where at least we can agree on what are the fundamental issues, what are the fundamental facts that we are grappling with, and then there may be differences of opinion. But if you don't even start from the same basis for the discussion, how does anything else get tackled? And that's why that's I think unfortunately, and I hope this isn't we're getting closer to the end. I hope we don't completely end on this kind of note.
I'm going to ask us to go up somewhere.
Yeah.
But before we do, I want Glenn to come in because he's clearly in the mood to take us further down before we go
Yeah.
back up.
Okay.
So Glenn, there was a time when you would have said in the role that you had before that because of the science, the technology, the rationality, the power structure of the world, bad ideas couldn't survive. They couldn't survive the ballot box. They couldn't survive unless there were totalitarian regimes that were absolute in their power. But those chains were being broken. But today, here we are, where I can have a bad idea if I'm very powerful. Actually, if I'm not very powerful either, probably, I can have a bad idea. And if I control your perception and your awareness of what is reality sufficiently well, my bad idea can continue to survive for quite a while. Are we in that era where there are no consequences to bad ideas, including conquering?
I think there's still, yeah, I think there's still.
I have cognitive control, right?
Yeah, so yes, I think there's still consequences to bad ideas, but they may not be personalized to the person who had the bad idea, right?
Yeah.
And number one, I think the I'm sorry, I just forgot that there was something that you said that um, triggered the response here. Oh, I think the issue is that we have made it possible for everything to be relativistic. All right. And so and so I can take a really bad idea, I can take what is a bad idea and make it work relative to a particular point in time for a particular set of people who go, yeah, that's good, right? And connect at a level, and this goes all the way back to where John started, right, today, because I can now find relative threads to make connections that actually aren't really there, right? And so, I marvel sometimes at some of the statements that I hear
When
about,
dots that don't exist.
yeah, about dots that don't exist, or this person, is just like me. I'm like, you don't know anything about that person. Right. And there's if you take objective measures around these people, they're nothing like each other, right? But yet there's this sense of, oh, they're just like me, because we've made it so tuned, right, to that function that completes that story. And so in this highly relativistic, where everything's relative, where there's no sense of an ethical or moral standard in some places, it allows that to run rampant, right, in that space. And so putting that control back, the concept, as Annika was saying, not on the art side, but on the ethics side, the humanities, right, side of this, the Hobbesian debate that I talked that I referenced in the very beginning, right? About what is sovereignty and where does sovereignty really come from, right? These are discussions that we're not used to having, but we need to actually equip people to have these kinds of conversations and test and move these things forward. I do have a positive note, though, that I want to get to, but we'll get to that at the wrap up.
We're going to go to the positive in a moment. So, Annika, if you have mapped the supply chain that is underneath us thinking that we have cognitive agency, that we're making choices, but those choices are pre-framed because the algorithm has learned us. That supply chain is huge. We're not saying all the actors in that are good or bad or making no judgment, but it's a huge supply chain worth 13 to 15 trillion dollars based on the market caps of those companies. On the other side, the protection industry is relatively immaterial. It's rounding error. How do you see this disparity as you've looked at this equation, you've tried to capture the data? What are the elements of that supply chain of capture? Very briefly, because we have approximately 10 minutes, right, in total to sum it all up and bring it together and get positive.
Yeah, look, I think the following. I think there's two, like I kind of started with. There's two types of protection. There's a kind of or what actually there's three levels of protection, right? There's the macro protection, which is things like GDPR and things like big regulations that are attempting to protect a society as a whole or a population as a whole. Then there's the kind of meso level regulations which tackle individual companies and people in the supply chain, what they are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and a lot of this is through the contracts and things about what data they might be allowed to capture, what contracts they sort of get, how much of the supply chain they're allowed to own, etc. And then finally, there is the kind of individual level protections. And I think, this ultimately ties back even in your paper to kind of tie it all back together. The ultimate and the only real defense, no matter how you look at it, in the end, is what I've come to is it's ultimately about empowering the individual to retain the ability to make judgments. There are a number of ways in which a government can do this without sounding too anarchistic. I don't know whether the incentives particularly exist to empower individuals to the extent that is required. I think historically, from the beginning of time, governments have, or like empires, whatever, they've had the incentive to obviously not give people full kind of agency in terms of their ability to make judgments and what have you. However, obviously, like I don't want to blanket education, but like I say, one of the reasons why I talk about that kind of right brain or creative or kind of arts-based activity is very much that a little tidbit here. There's a documentary called The Power of the Heart, and in there's an experiment by the Heart Institute where they hook someone up, their brain and their heart, to a machine, and they're allowed to make a click, and an image comes on the screen that is either a very a photo that makes them anxious, like war or someone getting killed, or something that makes them relax, like a bunny. And what they found is when someone clicks, the heart actually reacts 4 seconds before the brain does in terms of what's seen. So if a distressing image is about to come on, the heart, before even seeing the image, actually senses that a distressing image is coming up and reacts, right? This happens over 95% of the time. So that tells you something, that, there are neuron clusters that are in other parts of our body that we are ignoring in this AI kind of era, that we have to kind of come back to. And that is the one protection governments and we as individuals can have and exert without there needing to be some crazy understanding of how AI works, which we know doesn't exist, or how these platform works, which we know doesn't exist, which in my opinion, at the macro level and the meso level are the main reasons why regulation and protections don't exist, because there's a fundamental lack of understanding and people are trying to regulate things they don't understand instead of something they do understand, which is how individuals think and how they react and how they behave. So, in terms of, I wish there was more. Yeah. So yeah, okay, I'll leave it there before saying anything that contradicts it.
I'm going to ask each of the others too to say, John, how do you seek to protect yourself and remain positive? Because I've known you a long time. You're a positive individual, and I would say realistic about what's happening in the world, and still remain positive. How do you protect yourself from cognitive capture?
Yeah, so I'll start with when I sort of became aware of this as an issue, but it was well before any of this technology. It was my actual university degree is in cognitive development, and one of the things they showed us during the course of that, which would be now a few years ago, was a small group of people passing a basketball around, and you're supposed to count how many times the basketball is passed. You do that, and then after that, they say, when did the woman cross the frame? And you inevitably say there was no woman, and then it's replayed, and you see a woman cross the frame, and you can't believe it. You actually did not see it.
It's the gorilla test, right?
Yeah. Yes, there are variations on this. That's right. But the point is, if you can capture intent, a person's intention, you literally affect what they do and do not see in the world. So this has been shown for, I don't know exactly when that started, but in my case, over 50 years ago. It's a very real thing. And to the point of your question, I think we ought to take some level of personal responsibility as well as the systemic level. And I think it goes back to first starting with what Glenn said, which is that you have to realize, and Annika said this too, that these are relativistic systems. These are not, and probabilistic systems. And you have to question, and you have to make an effort to have multiple sources of information. And I think a very deliberate effort to break out of information bubbles that you inevitably exist in. And you have to recognize that you do, and you have to make an effort to break out of it. And even if it sometimes is hearing things that do not invoke a dopamine response right away. In fact, they do quite the opposite. But it's important that people do that and be fed, and that there is industry developments that allow that encourage that give you multiplicity of viewpoints and things like that, and feed that to you. But lastly, I would go to just the more general, and it goes to the work that we've talked about, and that Annika specifically is doing around the measurement question, which is different groups are affected differently by different things, even within the macro, which there are many things that affect us all, but underneath that, there are many things that affect different groups differently and different individuals differently. And so gaining an understanding and a context around who you may be in that framework going forward will be a really important thing, because we are fundamentally, this goes back to that first experiment that I mentioned, we are unaware of the things that affect us in many cases, and we have to become, as individuals and as populations, aware of what actually we are susceptible to and what affects us, and have some agency around how we frame our environments to counter that. So I think, at some level, at the end of the day, there has to be personal responsibility, and that would be my, my conclusion.
Thank you, John. 2 to 3 minutes only, Glenn. How do you see the protection for you and your family? Is it spiritual? Is it technical? Is it technological?
Yeah, so for me, it's very spiritual. Right. I am a man of faith, and from that faith, there is a very simple command that that is actually harder to do in real life, but it's something that we strive for. And that command is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that second part takes real effort. And we don't always want to put that effort in. But in the way that we are built for relationship, and we are built for relationship with one another. And that's why I commented in the beginning, it's so strange to be so hyper connected and so isolated at the same time. And the more we allow that disconnect to happen, the harder it is. But the more we actually engage in empathy and from the position of understanding what is the hurt, what is the fear, what is the enemy within from the person who's sitting across the table or down the street or across the globe from us, right? We actually we produce a different basis for partnership and development in that space. The positive piece that I wanted to lay out very quickly comes back to the education piece that I think Annika was talking about earlier. I think the future of education is experiential learning. We, for years, have turned the education system into regurgitation of facts. And guess what AI is really good at? Regurgitating stuff. And so we freak out over the education system. But the future of this is experiential. And if we can, so we have the opportunity to actually, through experiential learning in whatever the discipline is, to actually look at the technology as a partner. But if we can build the pieces in that Annika's been talking about in terms of leveraging and giving agency back in, if we can teach the probabilistic inputs and probabilistic outputs and what does it mean to actually work with the machines, right, in order to actually move some of these key areas forward, then we move from substitution and blind faith to an earned trust. Right. And moving into that earned trust and agency with that empathetic piece that we've just been talking about, I think is a key for the future. I think humans prevail in the end, but I think it takes real effort, but we have to start now because
We have to
time
go through
is
Judgment
working
Day.
against us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got to get through Judgment Day, right? Okay. So I didn't mean that in a religious sense, of course, but if I step back and just try and draw it together, it's obviously been a wide-ranging discussion where we've begun with the macro of a civilizational shift from an industrial to an information era, the advent of technologies that are beyond the attention and the control and the speed of human brains, are automated to do things, therefore. And one of the things they do is to capture the attention. And in doing so, they colonize the individual's mind. Not necessarily even by intent, but that's what happens as a byproduct of the form of monetizable capitalism that exists. And the mechanism is you capture attention, you alter neural response, you monetize that response. And as a result, you modify real world behaviors. It is part of a transition. The same technologies that are used to potentially capture the mind could be used to liberate the mind because they're that finely attuned to the human being. That second hasn't yet been invested in a large scale and isn't seen as the prize. Maybe an accident of history, but I doubt it. It's a product of who we are at this stage. And we discussed who the enemy is, and we thought that the enemy was probably inside. What we are inside probably is the reason we're capturing rather than liberating at this stage. But we are at that point where we can make different decisions. It's not all completely gone. So there is a very positive part to the ideas you've heard of metacognition, of regulation macro-wise to protect, of something spiritual perhaps. And it brings us back to the idea that conscious awareness, the ability to understand what you're seeing and to have self-control and awareness of your own consciousness could be part of the answer. with that, I want to say that it's been delightful to have this conversation with some friends and colleagues, all part of, and I'll reference some of the things that they referred to. We have a foundational paper which is called The Rising Age of Cognitive Empire. It is available externally in pre-publication. We have an institute, the Institute of Strategic Intelligence and Intervention, based in London, with a global remit to look at sovereignty, of which cognitive sovereignty is one part. We are Force for Good, is the mission that funds that, or not very well for now, and also is a partner organization of the World Academy of Art and Science. We're delighted that we're invited to have this discussion with you, and this is the first taster of a discussion that will continue talking about global turbulence and the various aspects of peace, prosperity, and freedom at the annual conference of the World Academy in its 66th year that will happen in September online so that you can participate. I want to thank the Academy, I want to thank my colleagues and friends and all of you for spending time with us. And I hope you will take the opportunity to reflect on how you protect yourselves and your families and communities in a time where we can all be captured without realizing and lose maybe the most important thing, which is ourselves in the process. Thank you.